Classic Trucks.
The truck drivers of America have often been called the last cowboys. But many Americans forget that these road-weary truckers and their predecessors have helped make the American dream come true.
When you're out in the western states in the middle of the night, crossing Montana, you don't see nobody. You are like the last cowboy. You're the only one there.
We carry ice cream, frozen meats,
hazardous materials, medical supplies.
We've carried carpet,
the computer parts.
We transport human bodies,
locomotives, railroad cars,
food, general freight.
With a confusing array of state or federal taxes and weight legislation, driving a truck in America today is fraught with bureaucracy. The modern truck, with its satellite tracking systems, onboard computers and air conditioning, is an office and a home on wheels. At the turn of the century, American trucks were little more than motorised buggies.
That's what a one-cylinder engine sounds like running. Well, this truck, you know, just had a one-cylinder engine, very light wheels, nothing but a motorized wagon. It didn't have a lot of power. Built for the mud roads they had back then. And basically they hauled, as you can see, not very much. A few items back and forth to town. 1912, it was called a high-wheeler. Ransom E. Olds built this truck.
Although Olds claimed his high wheeler could haul half a ton and was more efficient than a horse and wagon, it was really little more than a novelty.
But it didn't take Olds long to figure out he needed something bigger and heavier. And by 1914, 1913 actually, he built the first Model J, just the following year after this truck. And there we went to the four-cylinder engine. It's heavy-duty chain drive, a lot heavier wheels and tires, and geared down for power. This truck could haul a load. This would be truly a truck. And of course, in the early years, there was 1,801 companies built trucks. There was every kind of size and make imaginable. You had your electrics, your gasoline, steam. They had them all.
These little trucks were useful for delivering from farm to market, but the railroad was still king for long-haul transportation. The real problem for trucks was the state of the roads, adequate for a horse and buggy, but hopeless for heavier motorised vehicles. In 1919, future President Ike Eisenhower, a young army officer, took part in a convoy of trucks from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. The journey was a publicity stunt to demonstrate the terrible state of America's roads. The military felt that without adequate highways, the defence of the nation was at risk. With the roads in such a poor state, early American trucks had to be durable. Mack is one of the most famous names in American trucks. The saying, built like a Mack truck, came from their reputation for rugged and reliable vehicles. Tom Spencer is a restorer with a special affection for Macks.
We found a bunch of trucks up in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, in a building up there. A fellow 92 years old died, and he had all these trucks stored inside in a building. This is an example of what was up there. This is an AB Mack, vintage probably about 1922. Here we have another real nice early AB Mack, solid tires. Everything's in here. Here's the upholstery still in the truck. Look at this beautiful sign on the side. Isaac Finkel and Sons, Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Roasted and packed. Coffee. Yankee Girl. Isn't that neat? They have what they call an express body on them, or a flare side body. They're shaft drive ABs. This one still has the canvas curtains on the side. A little worse for wear, but that's what used to keep the weather off you back in the old days. Diamond City Beef Company.
The AB's big sister was the AC. Its pugnacious-looking exterior hid some surprisingly advanced engineering.
Another interesting, here's an engine out of an AC Mack. Look at the aluminum used. Look at this beautiful casting. Remember, this was back in the 20s. All cast aluminum. So aluminum castings to Honda and the rest of these cars is nothing new. Mack was doing it back in the 20s.
Ex-driver and truck enthusiast Bud Dawson.
This is a 1916 AC chain-driven Mack, produced in Allentown, Pennsylvania in 1916. This is the very first one off the assembly line. Okay, the first thing you do is you turn the fuel. You turn on the petrol. You can also drop your petrol in the priming cups. You open the petcocks, and you will hear the compression. This is for cold starting. You bring it up to the compression, you flip the impulse coupling. The impulse coupling on the magneto spins the mag real fast and gives it a hot shot of spark in the start position.
If the AC's starting procedure is a little involved, the driving experience is simple and familiar.
You have a 3-speed transmission with 1 reverse. First is all the way over to the right and back. Give it a little bit of petrol, a little throttle. Leave the clutch out. Bring it up to a speed. And then you go to second gear. Now I'm in second gear. I'll wind it out. Now we're in third gear. We're in high gear. At the front is the radiator. The hot air is thrown off to the side on the outside and not on the inside. One might say, well, they should have a guard over there. Protect your feet. Well, common sense, you don't stick your feet in the fan.
The AC, or Bulldog, became the world's most famous truck.
It came from the First World War. The Mack Bulldog was named in Europe and France. It was as rugged as a bulldog. And also as ugly.
If the American West had been won on horseback, its cities and roads were now going to be built on the back of a truck.
But this vehicle weighs 9,800 pounds empty. It will haul 10,000 pounds, which is 5 tons. 5 tons was a terrific amount of weight for a team of horses and a wagon. Almost impossible.
The horse and the mud roads were things of the past. America needed concrete highways, and the Bulldog's simple and robust design was converted to every kind of construction vehicle. The basic chassis was so tough that many bulldogs continued working well into the 1950s.
We got to show you this one. That's a 1948 Flathead Cadillac. Somebody took the Cadillac V8 engine and the automatic transmission and put it in this old AC Mack. Had to get a little more cooling, so they cut the hood out. Cut out part of the frame here on this breastplate. Get a little more air into the radiator. Now he's got the radiator up front in this to cool this truck, rather than back here. These were the original radiators on this. Detroit, Michigan is where this truck came from. We were out there and this old man comes in the yard out there, comes hobbling in on a cane. He says, I drove that truck for 34 years. I says, isn't that something? He says, one day I pulled in the yard, I had a ticket in my hand. I gave it to the boss because the boss used to pay all the tickets. Boss looked at it, he says, holy smokes, he says, 71 miles an hour. Boss looks at him and he says, I wonder how fast that truck will go. And the guy says 72. I wouldn't want to be in it because, God forbid, it still had the old AC Mack brakes, and that's a real problem.
Brakes were very poor, especially going downhill. When you went downhill, you wanted to be sure that you geared the transmission down to make the engine operate like a brake too. So what you would do was put it back into second gear. And that acted like a brake. It would hold you back.
By the time the AC went out of production in 1938, the Bulldog had given Mack a trademark and played its part in building modern America. In the 40s and 50s, it was to be trucks that would help make America become a vision of the future that was the envy of the world.
So there you are then, new engines, new interiors, restyled front and rear, the new face of the Vauxhall Astra.
Yes, but our customers deserve more. Any thoughts?
How about power steering as standard there throughout the range?
Think of the cost. Only a buffoon would consider it.
Well, your power steering was inspirational.
Thank you very much. You haven't seen anything of GD, have you?
Yes, I thought a spell in the vehicle exterior luster department might do him good.
To help you cope with the unexpected, our financial plans adapt. Ally Dunbar, for the life you don't yet know.
Antiques Roadshow, expertise at your fingertips with the new BBC A to Z of antiques hunting. Discover Britain's hidden treasure in only 20 weekly parts.
America can't wait. You want what you want when you want it. So the trucks are rolling. Rollin' trucker, keep rolling along. Rollin' trucker, rolling song.
Despite PR films like this that showed trucking as a vital service to the nation, in the 30s and 40s, Americans thought trucks chewed up the roads and didn't pay enough tax. But like them or not, Americans were becoming dependent on trucks.
This particular truck is a livestock truck. You haul cattle and hogs in it. If you went a long distance with cattle, you had to stop and give them rest. You had to water them, let them go to the bathroom, and give them a little feed.
In the days before animal rights, just how the famous American T-bone arrived on the table didn't matter. As long as it was fresh and untrampled, the trucker had done his job.
You had to be careful. You had to load your cows tight in the trailer, and you had to keep a constant eye on them to make sure none of them laid down. If you loaded them tight, they would stand up. They would stay up. We used to have electric shockers about so long, and we used to poke them to make sure to get them up if they got down.
This 1930 GMC, with its enclosed sleeper cab, was beginning to look like an American truck.
You would get to the stockyard, maybe they didn't want the cattle at that particular time, and it was a time for you to lay down and take a nap or a rest. This truck only runs 30 miles an hour, so if you was going any great distance, it took a long time.
Sleeper cabs were unusual in the 1930s, but they were later to become essential to the long-haul truck.
From 30 miles away, from across the river, from 100 miles in the valley, from the railroad yards, from the docks, from 200 miles across the mountains.
As trucks started to cross state boundaries, bureaucracy for the drivers and operators increased.
Singing wheels that serve...
You would have to have the correct permit. You would have a state license plate for your state, and your state should have a reciprocity agreement with the next state. If it did not have a reciprocity agreement, you would have to buy a permit to go into that state. They usually allowed you in there for 2 days, 48 hours, sometimes 72 hours. But you always had to have these permits.
Another crucial invention to the long-haul truck was the articulated trailer, made possible by a device called the fifth wheel. Secured by a steel kingpin, the fifth wheel allowed the trailer to be attached and articulated to the tractor unit. Detachable trailers decreased turnaround time, so that the truck could get back on the road and earn money. America still did not have the interstates that Eisenhower thought would be vital to the defense of the nation, but at least it was now possible to drive coast to coast without getting stuck in the mud. This 1937 International managed about 4 miles to the gallon. For trucks to go truly long haul, the truck makers were going to have to end their love affair with petrol engine gas guzzlers and think seriously about the more economical and robust diesel engine. With petrol at only 17 cents a gallon, there was no great hurry to change. By adding a supercharger to a diesel engine, West Coast company Kenworth achieved gasoline-style performance.
This was the tractor that pulled the mountains, the Rockies, and the Great Western Plains. This is a 1938 Kenworth. This is a Western tractor. Now this truck is pretty much basically the same, except for the chrome air cleaners, the chrome mirrors, and the chrome horns. But this is the engine. This has a Cummins diesel engine in with a belt-driven supercharger. This engine was ahead of its time. A gas engine this size and a diesel engine like this, the gas will give you more power because there's more BTUs, British Thermal Units of Measurement of Heat, in a gasoline engine than a diesel. But the diesel is the longevity. It'll run 3 times longer, and it'll give you 3 times better the fuel. And this is what you're after, was the fuel economy of the diesel engine.
On great construction projects, brawny giants move with ponderous, powerful dignity, carrying tremendous loads easily and dependably.
The economy of diesel suddenly became important. America was building itself out of the Depression with a massive road construction program that would make long-haul trucking a reality.
Our modern civilization depends upon the great network of highways lacing America into one great community. And trucks built the highways. The smooth ribbons...
As the highways developed, they started building, of course, much bigger trucks. This particular truck here is an LTL Mack. This would have been what you would consider a West Coast truck. These trucks weren't even allowed here on the East Coast because the roads were too narrow and too tight, back even into the late 40s. These were the original, let's say, highway trucks. These were high horsepower, big, long, heavy trucks. Could haul big, heavy loads. And they'd haul them over the mountains, over the Rocky Mountains, say from Albuquerque or Chicago to California.
As the trucks got larger and the routes more challenging, specialist carrier companies proliferated. After the Second World War, companies like PIE, Pacific Intermountain Express, invested heavily in highly organised operations that capitalised on the post-war boom in America.
Schedule 180 just arrived at Kansas City. And add this one, 283 out of St. Louis for Los Angeles. Yes, Lloyd? How many units on the road today? 182, 90 westbound and 92 eastbound.
The latest Peterbilt cab-over trucks meant that PIE could haul longer trailers and still be within state regulations. But the truck industry was still fighting a public relations battle. PIE wanted to take trucking out of the fly-by-night greaseball era.
The highway and the motor carrier are two of our great economic assets. Assets that must continue to be developed and maintained at the highest point of safety and efficiency if our American way of life is to continue to grow and prosper.
In 1947, PIE spent $70,000 on the Mighty Mite. The Mighty Mite was a half-scale Peterbilt cab-over truck and trailer that toured county fairs to create a cuddly image for trucking. Behind the corporate public relations, life behind the wheel was still work for a tough guy. This 1958 autocar with a stainless steel Fruhoff trailer was a typical rig of the time.
Driving a big truck is nothing like it. It's a real man's job, I guess.
With no power-assisted steering, it may have been a man's job. But George Schroyer was little more than a boy when he drove his first truck.
My first experiences, I remember, I was about 11 years old, and I drove from Salina partway to Detroit, Michigan, and that's pretty young to be driving a truck. I suppose I could just about see over the steering wheel even.
Like today's trucks, the original owner of George's turbocharged autocar would have specified whatever combination of engine or gearbox most suited the job.
There's a Cummins 262 engine. Standard engines about of that day was 160, 180 horsepower. Spicer 4x4 transmission. Yeah, you have to learn to shift the gears, and I didn't do a very good job there. I could hear the teeth clanging. This being the 262, we'll have the turbo, and that was a classic of 1958, 1960. If you had a engine like a 262, you had a real truck.
By the late 50s, the long-haul truck was established, and Ike's interstate system was under construction. In this 1958 Kenworth cab-over, the driver sat on top of a massive engine. If you could stand the noise, it would go on forever.
In the last 30 years, I accumulated a little over 5 million miles on this truck. I put a little over 2 million with Brady Motor Freight. I put a little over 1 million miles with Wright Motor Lines, Rocky Ford, Colorado, and a little tiny bit over 2 million miles with Ace Lines out of Des Moines, Iowa. And very proud to say that I was the only guy in this country to drive the same truck for 35 years and put 5 million miles on a piece of equipment. I think that's a great thing.
The doors of this truck stop on Interstate 80 haven't closed since the route opened in 1964. The truckers of the 90s still have a maverick image, but the road and the truck are the enduring images of American folk culture. Without them, the West would still be wild.
Me and Jawbo was going to town, riding a gray horse and leading a hound. Pound Bob, the old horse jump. Old Jawbo, this guy was gone. Old Jawbo, he promised me, before he died, he'd make a will for me. Live so long, his head got bald. Got out of no good down at all.
classic truck story continues next Tuesday at 8 o'clock.
In Britain during the 1950s, the Leyland Octopus was the king of the road and essential to commercial life. Life on the road was hard, but it was worthwhile. These former drivers are proud men.
We felt that, sat round this table, we did a good job in the early days.
They were waiting for you, weren't they?
That's right.
They were waiting for you. There's no way of getting to some of them places without a lorry, was there?
No.
There's no trains, nothing.
No.
So a lorry had to take it. And this is where you started finding back roads.
That's right.
Going through places you shouldn't have gone. Little villages and...
exactly, yes.
Going over bridges that you shouldn't have gone.
You shouldn't have. I know, yeah.
Knocking telegraph wires down.
That's right, yes.
The standard of living that I reckon we enjoy today has been brought about by the wagon.
This wagon is a Super Sentinel from 1924. It's steam-powered, so just like a railway locomotive, the engine is fired up with a paraffin-soaked rag. An hour and a half later, it's finally ready to go.
You start off, you put it in forward gear, handbrake off.
Open the regulator. Go on. Give it a bit more.
No, it's the flashing there on you.
No, you're all right. Go on.
The Super was an advanced machine, a ruthless attempt to give Sentinel control of the steam wagon industry and so win a bitter commercial war that had been raging for a generation. The first powered wagon, built in 1896, was more cart than truck, and, like most of 19th century industrial Britain, the Thornycroft No. 1 steam van burnt coal to get up steam to power its engine. At the turn of the century, Britain was enjoying a trade boom. Steam-powered wagons soon found a niche, spreading goods from the docks to the railheads and even into the cities. Trade was still expanding when, in 1905, this arrived, the Foden 5-ton, which could actually carry a payload of 7 tons. Because the engine was over the boiler, it was called an overtype. As is conventional today, it was steered by the front wheels, and it was powered through the rear wheels. over 7,000 5-tons were sold, which established Foden as the first steam wagon giant. Then, in 1914, came the Sentinel standard. It was an undertype, which meant a vertical boiler with the engine underneath it. This layout allowed more payload space, but it was usually rejected as complex and unreliable. The Sentinel was reliable and could move a 6-ton payload fast, perhaps too fast.
I started driving in 1922 when I was 14, and I've just been driving ever since. In the very early days, my speed limit with the steam wagon and trailer on solid tires was 5 miles an hour. And I've had many convictions for travelling at 7.5 and 8 miles an hour.
In fact, during the early 1920s, 8 miles an hour was slow, and the heavy steam wagons struggled to stay in front of much lighter and speedier petrol-engined vans. Foden reacted in 1924 with the C-type, whose top speed of 25 miles an hour was achieved with a powerful engine and 3 cast steel gears.
Well, once we've got steam and we're ready to move off, then we have to put it into gear. And these are the gears here. We move this lever into 1 for the first gear, back here for the second gear, and then come into this one for the top gear for when you're ready to go off on the road. Well, having set the engine in gear, then we go to the reversing lever, and this is which is this lever here. And to going forward, you put it in the forward position. You want to go backwards, you put it in the rear position. So if we say we're ready to go forward, then you've got to operate the regulator. You push it forward, and then the engine will move.
Steam wagon gears were not like car gears.
I would never try to change gear when it's actually moving. We normally stop the engine, then we change gear.
Foden had taken well-proven steam technology and improved it. Power was generated by an old agricultural-style compound engine.
The compound engine is one where the steam goes into the high-pressure cylinder and then it's exhausted into the low-pressure cylinder, in effect using the steam twice over. The steering is quite heavy. You need a fair bit of arm power to move it. The same, of course, applies to the brakes, the foot brakes, and you need fairly strong legs, especially when you're hurtling downhill and you've got to pull up 9.5 tons.
This actual Foden was bought by Fuller's Brewery of West London in 1928. A year Britain's thriving industrial workforce slaked their thirsts on about 6 billion pints of beer. Many large breweries ran steam wagons, and Sentinel's spacious undertype standards were a popular choice. Sentinel could not afford to lose such markets to Foden, and it didn't. Thanks to the Super, which finally gave Sentinel control of the vital steam wagon industry. This clever cocktail of tradition and invention mixed an efficient but heavy chain drive with lightweight leaf spring suspension and even electrics. Steam wagons were reaching their peak.
Well, I've always looked upon steam as effortless power. There's no fussing with it at all. It just goes along when you're stationary, and you just open the regulator gently. There's no clutch to slip in and gears to grind or anything like that. You just open the regulator gradually, it just moves up.
Amazingly, this actual Sentinel worked the Liverpool docks until the 1960s. Its drivers, John Meacock and Jimmy Doran, have not met for 30 years. But they are soon right back where they left off.
Well, have a look at your fire, see how your coal is.
All right.
Alright, plenty of coal on there. Plenty on. Good fire.
Our main job was cattle food.
Cattle food, alright.
Used to cart all the
cattle
material off the dock for making cattle food. Linseed oil cake, bran,
groundnut cake,
pollards.
Good though it was, the Super Sentinel was an anachronism by the 1960s. It had been clear as early as 1930 that heavy, coal-fired steam wagons were inefficient at converting thermal energy into pulling power. There was another, much more efficient technology, diesel.
And there was a big drift to the diesel when it started, and they got all the snags out of them kind of thing. When we first got our diesel wagons in 1933, I used to go to London and back from Widnes with 15 tons on for 7 and 6pence.
Sentinel was undaunted by diesel and reacted with the S4. The press raved about its most satisfactory performance and manoeuvrability that is quite out of the ordinary. With a top speed of 50 miles an hour, the S4 was much faster than any diesel, but it was also heavier, and that was its problem. A 1930 government report had claimed steam wagons were a nuisance and a danger to the public. In 1933, any vehicle weighing over 4 tons, which included the S4, faced penal taxes. By the mid-30s, even Sentinel had to face the fact that, despite the S4, steam was dying.
Now there's a new force to relieve all your cold and flu symptoms. New Nurofen Cold and Flu.
No, no, no. You don't love me, and I know now. No, no, no. You don't love me as I know now.
Here's all you need to know about the worldwide on-time express guarantee from UPS.
George, I got your package right on time.
UPS, as sure as taking it there yourself.
For generations, the Foden Works brass band has entertained the people of Sandbach, the small Cheshire town where Edwin Foden built his first steam wagon in 1901. Today, the band plays on, although it's no longer bankrolled by Foden, and Sandbach is a very different place. Throughout the age of steam, Foden was the only wagon builder in Sandbach. Then in 1930, when steam was dying, the Foden family began to tear itself apart. The old boss Edwin was long dead. His eldest son Willie had emigrated to Australia. Sam Twemlow, Edwin's favourite son-in-law, was dead. E.R., Edwin's second son, was still on the Foden board, but was in dispute with the chairman, Francis Poole, who was his brother-in-law, and with his stepmother, Edwin's second wife Annie. E.R.'s surviving son Peter remembers this dispute.
My father's stepmother was a bit of a bee. She had a reputation of being difficult, put it that way, and she was a bit of a... She owned a lot of the shares in Foden's in those days, a big shareholder, and she was a bit of a tyrant, I gather. It's a bit tough.
Under Annie Foden's influence, the chairman Francis Poole announced, "We honestly feel we should be better keeping to steam."
And my father said, look, we have to move from steam, because in those days steam lorries were the thing, and diesel lorries were just coming in. And my father wanted to change more rapidly than they did, and so there was a fallout amongst the family at the time, and he said enough is enough, and he went. Simple as that.
But E.R. only went to the other end of Sandbach, where he set up a new company called ERF. Here, he and his descendants would manufacture diesel wagons, using the lessons they had learnt at Foden.
What have I learnt from the days of the Foden days? I suppose I've learnt not to employ too many of my relations, probably.
ERF relied on outside talent from the very beginning, when they called in a brilliant young designer.
They got Ernest Sherratt, who was a designer at the old Foden company, to join them, and then in a greenhouse in Sandbach they drew out the first ERF. That was in April 1933, and by September they produced the first vehicle.
The engine, gearbox and axles and the frame were all used by the industry in general, but put together in slightly different ways. First thing is the Gardiner engine, which had been a well-proved engine. That was the obvious thing to go for. Next in line is the gearbox with the David Brown box. That was the answer there. The axles, Kirchstall 40 axles, they were also used by everyone in the country who were making vehicles. So they're the three major components, and marrying those together was the task, which was a very enjoyable one for me.
The sturdy, low-revving Gardiner Diesel was designed to power boats. But once inside the first ERF, it inspired a revolution in British wagons. Lightweight, but able to carry an 8-ton payload, this four-wheeler soon turned ERF into a major wagon builder. The third customer to receive one was the Sandbach family firm, Hackney's.
Lovely vehicle, lovely to ride in. I used to go to, my husband used to go to Cambridge, and we used to go at 5, and he'd drop me off in Northampton, and then he'd pick me up. He went to Fison's at Austin with 6 cylinders from Murgatroyd's, and it's as nice as any today.
This hastily assembled wagon was so advanced that other manufacturers were forced to copy it. even ERF's family rival and neighbour, Foden.
Now we see the engine being lowered into position from an overhead crane. This six-cylinder diesel develops 102 brake horsepower at 1,700 revolutions. Now the gearbox and radiator. The engine and gearbox are mounted on the Foden three-point suspension system, ensuring freedom from vibration.
The new generation of assembled diesel wagons triggered a new road transport boom.
And you just keep moving up and down the country. It may be Newcastle, Liverpool, Newcastle, Manchester. You know, things like that. Or Aberdeen down to Cornwall, pick up some china clay from St Atholl, around that area. Back up for Manchester. Back up again to Glasgow. Picking a load up, say, Dundee at 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. When you get your instructions, the boat closes in Southampton the following day at about 5 o'clock in the evening. So what do? You've got to go through the night. You know, you've already done one through the night. And you've got to go again through the night, right down to Southampton, to catch the boat. As a rule, we used to try and work it so we could pass through our own hometown, probably on the way up and down, at least maybe once a week, or you couldn't always do that. I've actually come in at about maybe 10, 11 o'clock at night, maybe midnight. Just sneak quietly in, got the frying pan out, had a bit of a fry up, wash and shave, lie on the sofa, 2 hours maybe, get up, leave a note, been and gone, see you sometime. And they've never known I've been in.
Although this heavy traffic was diesel-powered, there were trace elements of the steam wagons. This 1920s test film shows the world's first rigid chassis 8-wheeler. Each wheel had 14 inches of independent movement. All 4 front wheels steered, creating a turning circle just twice as wide as the wagon was long. Sadly, the 8-wheeled steam wagon was a futile effort, because it faced the same legal restriction on payload as a much cheaper 4-wheeler. But as road traffic expanded, thanks to diesel power, the law was altered to regulate payloads by axle weight, and a 4-axle 8-wheeler was allowed to carry 10 tons more than a 2-axle 4-wheeler. That's why, in the early 1930s, the London bus maker AEC put its powerful bus engine into the first diesel-powered, rigid chassis 8-wheeled wagon, the Mammoth Major. And the modern British wagon was born. But the most important asset passed on from steam to diesel was not technological. It was the attitude of the drivers. Slow, steady, and proudly independent.
We're going back to the very, very early days of our driving careers, which in my case was a late 40s, early 50s, when the speed limit for the lorries was only 20 miles an hour, which meant you could do Lancashire to Bristol, 186 miles, 11 hours, no more. Lancashire to Cambridge, 11 hours.
Well, when I was coming out of Bodmin and Moor, you know what it's like up there, I'm looking through the mirror there, and there's a tractor behind with hay on or something.
That's right.
Passed me.
And he was pulling away from me.
He passed me with a tractor, That's how,
There was no powered steering.
No.
Nothing. You had to
That's
have
why we're such strong lads, isn't it?
Arms, like a gorilla. That's right, yes.
Yes,
right.
And then they used to say, all drivers are sat in cabs to get no exercise. Got more exercise than anybody.
The vehicles at the time...
Oh, they were.
The ultimate.
Did the job.
Yeah.
Make no mistake about it.
Civilization as we know it today would grind suddenly to a halt. There's no two ways about that without road haulage.
Well, it would have done in the early days, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would have done even in the early days. No matter what period you're speaking of, without transport, you're finished.
Yeah.
You've got to have it.
The book Classic Trucks by Nicholas Faith is out now in most bookshops, priced $16.99.
In 1914, the remote village of Ingham was first connected to the outside world by a bus route. And over the next 30 years, the bus became a vital lifeline to this small community. Then, as these villagers remember, it was the bus that brought freedom at the end of the Second World War.
Here we are again. Off to Lincoln.
Throughout the war, Lincoln's buses suffered terribly. This coach was packed with passengers when it was hit by an incendiary bomb. The few buses that survived till the VE Day parade were decrepit and uncomfortable. It was the same all over Britain. In Nottingham in 1945, these pre-war Leyland cheetahs were clearly overstretched. As few people had cars, trips to the shops, the cinema, or even the recently reopened beaches were nearly always made by bus. Britain's bus makers realised that the next generation of buses would have to carry many more passengers. And in the search for extra capacity, bus design, which had previously been conservative, began a decade of radical technological innovation. In Britain, the post-war recovery of the 40s and 50s was accompanied by a superficial stability. Bus services, like many important industries, were strictly regulated, and the law guaranteed most operators impregnable monopolies. There was even a law against running a double-decker without a conductor.
I came out of the army and I wanted a job, and I thought, well, if I got on the buses, it would be a regular job. That's what I done. And as I say, it was a regular job for 31 years.
The vehicle in which Reg Durrant began conducting was called a trolley. Ipswich had nothing else at the time. Trolleys were everywhere once. Halfway between the outgoing trams and the incoming motor buses, they were powered by electricity. Ipswich Council, which owned the town bus service, had chosen trolleys to replace its trams, mainly because it owned the local electricity grid. But here, as elsewhere, the trolleys thrived on the post-war flood of passengers.
It was nice, quiet vehicles and easy to drive. There was no noise, no pollution, and they were popular with the public.
The reasons for this popularity lay under the trolley's floor. A direct current at a potentially lethal 600 volts was fed into a bank of resistors. The driver used these resistors to vary the voltage that was filtered through to spin an electric traction motor. As the voltage varied, so did the speed. It was quieter, smoother, and faster than a combustion engine.
Personally, I think they were the ideal mode of transport for town work. The only restriction, of course, was the fact that you had all the overhead wiring, and that restricted you to where you travelled on the road. If you travelled too far away from the wires, you had a bit of an accident and off came your trolley arms and you lost your power. And I remember on one particular occasion, it was a very, very foggy morning, and we wandered too far. In fact, I ended up on that particular occasion with the nose of the bus quite near the front of a public house, which was some distance from where I should have been.
For decades, the limits of the trolley's overhead electricity grid contained Ipswich. But by the late 40s, the town had begun to spread. New homes, to replace the industrial slums the Luftwaffe had destroyed, were built in pleasant housing estates on the outskirts of town. But the council couldn't afford to expand the trolley's electricity grid to reach them. That's why, in 1950, the diesel-powered AEC Regent, which had already proved itself alongside trolleys in London, was introduced into Ipswich. The Regent used a huge 9.6-litre diesel engine, a fluid flywheel and hydraulic brakes to mimic the smooth ride of a trolley. Gear changes were further smoothed by a pre-selector. A driver pre-selected a new gear whenever there was time. Later, when road conditions demanded that gear change, it was triggered and was shifted automatically by compressed air. The passengers hardly felt a thing, but then they were so desperate for a bus, they wouldn't have cared anyway.
We gradually saw the estate being built round us, and I think it was about 2 years before the buses came up here.
We were a bit isolated really up here to start with, but when the buses came, we felt that we were more into the town.
I visited relatives more than I did without the buses.
We used to go to the pub and have a sing-song and come home. We used to play the piano, and there you are. That was especially Saturday nights.
Saturday nights was a balmy night. And all the essentials such as chemists and all things like that, you relied on the bus to be able to get into town, to be able to get those kind of things.
Tooraloo, tooralay, it's a jolly fine club, and let's keep it that way.
Gradually, more and more Ipswich bus routes became diesel-powered. Diesel meant flexibility. And gradually, the inflexible trolleys were put out to grass, until eventually there was just one left.
When I drove the last one out of service, last one to ever operate in Ipswich, on service, it was Friday, August the 23rd, 1963. All the normal people that were on board were fare-paying passengers. They paid their fare and they had a ride. Although we were due in the shed here at 6:57, I think it was about 20 minutes to 8 before we got in. So we were delayed with all the sort of amateur photographers that come from all over and transport enthusiasts. Once we got to the depot here, the news must have spread because all the locals were outside and they wanted autographs and so forth. So I felt quite an important person at the time. Quite an occasion, really. Sad in many ways.
All that's left of the trolleys is their grid of wires and poles, which now carries domestic electricity. and is a reminder of how much this town once depended on trolleys. At the edge of town stands the last pole, and at its base is a turning circle. Here, this was as far as the trolleys could travel, and it still marks the boundary between urban Ipswich and rural Suffolk. Out-of-town buses were very different, thanks to Bedford, a British subsidiary of the American conglomerate General Motors. Bedford repackaged its austere pre-war OB with radical styling. With its small and reliable petrol engine, the OB would do 12 miles to the gallon while cruising at 40 miles an hour. Coach travel offered affordable luxury, and clever operators were quick to exploit its full potential. Some even made films about it.
Yes, that's the old Huntingdon Street office.
Yes. That's it, yes. Of course, that was a big place, wasn't it?
Elson Barton's family once owned the bus operation in Nottingham. During the 50s, the Barton family firm laid on film shows in local village halls. As a film was projected, timetables and publicity brochures were handed out to an audience of potential passengers. The films were of Barton's continental coach holidays. These were tours, styled on the then popular sea cruises. In fact, Barton promoted a tour as
a road cruise, using the best of hotels, the best bus he could find, everything all in at a single price.
As late as 1950, with car ownership still stuck at its pre-war level, few Britons holidayed abroad, so a road cruise was considered very exotic, and the coaches reflected that.
Oh, this is at Dover.
This is Dover Whitefish Hotel, isn't it?
Yes, it's one of the...
and the vehicle, here she comes, that's right. It was a Leyland Royal Tiger.
With a Burlington coach on it.
Burlington body, yes.
Burlington body on it, yes. We had two of those, didn't we?
We did.
Yes,
yeah.
which were did
very modern in design at the time,
yeah.
but they were terrific weight.
They used to
They
have
rub them away, didn't they?
Yes, they used to have to lift them on the, crane them on the ferry, didn't they?
That's right.
And we had to pay a lot more money because they were heavy, weren't
That's right, a terrific weight.
Hard work.
But the Leyland's weight made them graceful cruisers. This was first-class travel.
Down by the level.
And the coach was always spotless. It had lovely headrests every day, clean ones, and when you went to anywhere, they sort of made you so welcome. So it was yes, the service was first class. Always helped out with the coach. Your luggage was always taken to your room. You were always asked each day if everything was okay.
Mind you needed a few quid.
I know there were farmers and there was an accountant and there were a couple of shopkeepers. They were all fairly middle class.
Bank managers, solicitors, people who owned their own business.
Continental Europe, still slowly recovering from the war, must have been shocked by the unashamed opulence of a road cruise. These machines, with their two-tone paintwork and chrome trimmings, were the flagships of a very self-confident industry. Citroën have discovered a gap in the market. An estate car that's almost as compact as the acclaimed ZX hatchback, but with an enormous load area of up to 55 cubic feet. Perfect for when you're expecting the patter of tiny feet. The Citroën ZX Estate, from £10,355. Discover what Citroën can do for you.
Gillette introduces the next revolution in shaving closeness. Microfins. And they're only on the new Sensor XL. These microfins precede the blades. As Sensor XL's spring-mounted blades adjust to your face, these soft, flexible fins gently stretch your skin so your beard stands up for the closest, most comfortable shave. Get closer than ever before. Get the new Gillette Sensor XL.
This 1951 Bristol L was a rare early prototype of a bus layout that is everywhere today. The single-decker coach with its engine under the floor. In the 50s, buses had huge engines, which covered a floor area equivalent to that occupied by 6 passengers. So underfloor engined coaches could earn 6 more fares than a traditional front-engine vehicle, and offered operators a significant economic advantage. And with the engine out of the way, the entrance could go at the front. Drivers could collect fares, so operators could do away with conductors. By the early 50s, coaches had become mobile boxes, often very profitable ones. Even remote rural routes had full loads, and not just during the daytime peaks, but also late at night.
There would be people going for outings and people going to the cinema, because at that time, of course, there were late night buses to get you back out to the villages. Something that, by and large, we've long since forgotten. And so there would be a whole kaleidoscope of people using these buses.
But parts of that kaleidoscope were beginning to fade. In 1950, less than 500,000 British homes had television. By 1960, over 10 million were tuning in. As more people stayed in, the highly profitable late-night bus services declined rapidly. Sadly, bus operators failed to see the implications of the goggle box. In fact, many rural services were far more concerned with contemporary advances in double-decker bus technology.
Of course, one of the problems that bus operators have had right from the early days, since they went over to closed-top buses, is the height of them. And around the country, as people will know, there are many, many low bridges. Of course, some of them far too low for a double-decker, would have to be single-deckers to go underneath. But many bridges, if the bus was just a little bit lower, it would go under. The solution to this was to build a lower height double-decker with a sunken gangway upstairs on the offside and 4 seats together. And when you sat upstairs, your head virtually touched the ceiling. If you sat downstairs on the offside, when you got up from your seat, you had to be careful not to bang your head on the sunken gangway. And the things were generally not terribly satisfactory.
This Bristol K was given a 53-seat low-height body by Row of Leeds in 1950, when it was operated by Keighley Transport on routes across the Yorkshire moors. For a while, this unsatisfactory gimcrack bus layout dominated rural transport, until it was superseded by something much better, the Bristol low-decker. The Route 103 into Lincoln was serviced by this low-decker in 1954. Although it crawled along, taking an hour and 40 minutes to complete its 30-mile route, it was low enough to fit under a 14-foot bridge, and it had a normal full arrangement of seats on both floors. The low-decker was ingenious.
Well, here we are underneath a low-decker. As you can see, it's a normal front-engined bus with a rear platform. But what makes this bus so special is that here, when we come back to the gearbox, instead of the drive shaft coming out of the centre of the gearbox, it comes out of the side and runs down off-centre to drive the rear axle. Now this allowed the Bristol company to install this, which is a sunken lower deck gangway, and the seats are on platforms either side of it. And so this made it possible to bring down the upper deck floor. And then when we get here to the rear axle, this too was revolutionary because this was a drop centre axle. Whereas before they had gone, the axle went across at the centre point of the wheels. This one, is, as you can see, is significantly lower. And here we see the gangway dropping down to the rear platform, which is this boarded area here.
The low-decker remained in production until 1968, and over 5,000 were made. Luckily, this low-decker has been preserved by a local museum, because, back out on the Lincoln edge, it jogs revealing memories in its old passengers, most of whom haven't met for 30 years.
That was the only way I could get to Lincoln, was on the bus.
Ah, that's right.
That used to be at half past 6.
Half past 6 at Fillingham Hilltop.
That's right, yeah. And
we used to catch it at 7:15.
Yeah, well, sometimes I didn't get home till 10 o'clock at night.
No, you didn't, my dear.
During the summer, once or twice, I usually relied on my sister here, but if my sister wasn't travelling, I had to rely on you to wake me up at Ingham, so I would frequently nod off.
Sleep didn't come easily on a low-decker. Noisy and bumpy, it had been designed to maximise capacity, not comfort.
Of course, the company peaked, as did many others, in 1952 or thereabouts, and services then began to go into decline with the rise of the private car.
By the end of the 50s, car ownership was almost treble its 1945 level, and still climbing fast. The demand for bus services was now in steep decline. But the struggle to fit more bums on more seats was still in full swing, with the Leyland Atlantean, the first bus to put the engine at the back. In this case, the engine was Leyland's own 9.8-litre unit, mounted sideways. With this huge power plant out of the way, passenger capacity climbed to a giddy 78 seats. And with the entrance at the front, the way was open for conductorless double-deckers. With the Atlantean, all buses, both double and single deckers, became standardised boxes. The period of radical innovation had reached its peak. Bus travel has never been the same since that golden era.
The book Classic Trucks by Nicholas Faith is in the shops now, price $16.99.
At Channel 4,